of African literature, and I'm going to quote his words. African literature is a group of associated units. In fact, the sum total of all national and ethnic literature of Africa. He went on further. A national literature is one that takes the whole nation for its province and has a realized or potential audience throughout its territory. In other words, he continued, a literature that's written, underline the word written, in the national language. And then he said an ethnic literature is one which is available only to one ethnic group within the nation. He gave a specific example. If you take Nigeria as an example, the national literature, he said, as I said, is the literature written in English. And the ethnic literatures are those written in Nigerian languages: Hausa, Igbo, Yoruba, Efik, Edo, Ibibio, and so on and so forth. And I've seen a number of Nigerians participating at this conference. Although this definition went a long way to define and identify, to define the identity of African literature with substantive credibility, it all the same was incomplete. If it were definitively final, the title of what we are doing today would not be what it is. Because what's omitted in Chinua Achebe's working definition of African literature, what's omitted is really something that is the foundation of all African literature. To be basic and simplify it for everybody, I would ask you to imagine a tree. That's the structure of African literature. At the top are branches that hold fruits. The branches rest on the stem of the tree, and the stem is held in place by the roots underground. Now apply them to African literature. The roots of African literature oral literature. Now, oral literature transmitted by word of mouth from generation to generation. The stem is the literature written in indigenous African languages, and the branches are the works written in European languages such as English and French. Early European theorists and critics at the time we're talking about saw the branches of the tree and defined African literature as branches. Apparently, they did not know anything, or even if they did know, they did not acknowledge the existence of the stem and the existence of the roots that hold up literature. So please, if you have any definition or study or teaching of African literature that includes the works in indigenous languages and oral literature, oral performances, for that matter, that definition, that teaching, that learning, that study is not only incomplete, it's abysmally wrong. Fortunately, there are today works on oral literature and physical dramatizations of some of these works that anybody studying African literature, researching African literature, should have easy access to. If you are teaching African literature, at least make your students aware of the foundational of African oral literature and literature written in indigenous languages. Elsewhere, I had stated categorically that oral literature embodies the raw and original African values. Children grow up under the tutelage of their mothers, and through the oral tales, especially the animal stories, they learn about good and evil in their society, In all this, the real significance of the folk tale or any of those tales is that it demonstrates the logic of behavior and its vital implications and consequences for life in general. So mothers, families use oral tales, folk tales, folklore, whichever you choose to call it, they use them in the serious upbringing of children. And also elsewhere, I've compared writings in indigenous African languages and writings in European languages by Africans. I had equally stated unequivocally that the African novel written in European languages, mainly English and French, emerged in the middle of the 20th century through the efforts of upcoming African writers to repudiate the distortions of African realities in fiction and memoirs by European colonizers. It was a literature of cultural and political protest. However, the novel in African languages, which was older, closer to its sociocultural environment, customs, and traditions, yielded a literature of cultural identity and affirmation. The values portrayed and narrative techniques employed were different from the portraits about Africa by European authors. I have released a book published by Routledge in England entitled The Literary History Novel. One of these ethnic, the literary history of the Igbo novel and literature in African languages. It's very expensive. They sell it £120 in UK, $155 in the United States. So in Nigeria, it will cost something like Naira. But I did give the publishers the permission to put an electronic version of the book so that you can download it free of charge. So if you haven't already done that, try and do that. In writing that book, I had to collect novels in Igbo language. So when we're talking about ethnic literature, it's not it's not a trivial thing. I have in my office here in Michigan more than 150 novels written in Igbo language. So sometimes there's the impression that Europe introduced the novel in Africa. It's not correct. In South Africa, we have Shaka Zulu, published in 1825. In Nigeria, we have Omenoko, which I have translated to English, published in 1933. Yoruba novel, published in 1938 by F.O. Fagunwa. So these are there. So the problem is that those early Europeans, early European critics and so on and so forth, were not able to understand literature in oral, in its oral form because it was in African languages, and they could also not read the literature in indigenous African languages. So it is important that I encourage African scholars at this time to try and translate as many of these early works in indigenous languages as possible so that the world can see what the novel was like before the early Europeans came to Africa. Now, how can you talk about introducing the novel form when the earliest works in English, the earliest African works in English were 1952, Tutuola, the Palm Wine Drinker, and 1958, Chinua Achebe, Things Fall Apart, for his Things Fall Apart. But I've already told you that the first novel in Igbo language was published in 1933. The first novel in Yoruba language was published in 1938. So how could you be introducing the novel in 1952 and 58? And Nigerian novels in Nigerian languages, had been published as early as 1933. In the time left for this presentation, let us now focus attention on Chinua Achebe and his first novel, Things Fall Apart. Some people have described Chinua Achebe as the inventor of African literature. The fact is that Chinua Achebe is the creative genius in 20th century African literature. But it's not only the creative genius, he also is the quintessential literary philosopher of the 20th century in Africa. He looked Europe in the eye and described their arts for art's sake theory, and I'm putting him, so these are not my words. He described arts for art's sake as mere deodorized dog shit. That was Chinua Achebe, not me. And you begin to imagine from his his non-creative, you could see Chinua Achebe, soft-spoken, but very seriously resilient and confident, taking on Europe. Now, he maintained that art had social purpose and function, and the work of art definitely must have a message. That differentiated the function of the writer or artist in Europe from that of artists in Africa. Achebe's unique distinctions as a novelist lie in the areas of informed vision and artistic integrity. His greatest legacy to 20th century world literature will be found in his pioneer role in the nativization of this language. His ingenious use of the English language is now a model for creative writers in situations where English is a second or foreign language all over the world. No African writer has, to the extent that Achebe has done, fashioned a conscious blueprint for imaginative creativity with a clearly constructed modus operandi for its realization. He defined African literature for the world of the 20th century and supplied for modern African writers the vital theme of the era. Again, listen very carefully, and I'm sure many of you have already read these quotations. Chinua Achebe defining the fundamental theme of African writing in the 20th century as follows. The fundamental theme in African writing is that African peoples did not hear of culture for the first time from Europeans. Their societies were not mindless, but frequently had a philosophy of great depth and value and beauty. They had poetry, and above all, they had dignity. It is this dignity that many peoples all but lost in the colonial period. And it is this dignity that they must now regain. He continued, the worst thing that can happen to a people is loss of their dignity and self. The writer's duty, and now this is where he differs from Europe, talking about art for art's sake. The writer's duty is to help his people, her people, regain the dignity, the self-dignity, the self-respect and dignity that they lost. And the writer can do this by showing them in human terms what happened to them, what they lost. Then he said, there is a saying in the Igbo language, in the Igbo culture, that a man who can't tell where the rain began to beat him cannot know where he dried his body. The writer can tell the people where the rain began to beat them. The writer's duty is to explore in depth the human condition. And then he concluded by saying,